Welcome to Creepy Whispers. I'm Jack Thompson, and here we'll explore stories that will send chills down your spine. Get ready to dive into the unknown, where each whisper hides a secret. First story. I don't even know where to start. It's been about 3 months since I moved to this neighborhood after my divorce. I thought it would be a fresh start, a quiet place to get my head straight. At first, it was going well. The neighborhood is really calm, lots of trees, and the neighbors seem nice. But then, about 2 weeks after I moved in, I started noticing strange things happening in the house next door. It's an old man's house. He must be in his 70s. He lives alone, from what I understand. At first, I didn't pay much attention, thought it was just in my head. But then things started to get kind of creepy. Like, I was washing dishes one night, and looking out the kitchen window, I saw a plant pot in the middle of the neighbor's yard. I thought it was strange because it wasn't there in the morning. The next day, the pot had disappeared. I thought maybe the old man decided to change the decoration, but then it started happening with other objects too. One day, it was a garden chair appearing out of nowhere. Another day, it was gardening tools scattered across the lawn. And the craziest thing is that I never saw the old man moving these things. It was as if the objects were moving by themselves. Man, I know it sounds crazy, but I swear it's true. Things started to get even weirder when I noticed the lights in the neighbor's house. It was as if they had a life of their own, turning on and off at completely crazy hours. There was one night I woke up to go to the bathroom, must have been around 3 in the morning, and I saw the light in his living room flashing like crazy. It wasn't like a burnt-out bulb flickering, It was more like someone was rapidly turning the switch on and off. I stood there watching from my bedroom window for a good few minutes, hypnotized by that bizarre light show. Suddenly, everything went dark again. I tried to convince myself it was just an electrical problem, but something deep in my mind told me there was more going on. And it didn't stop there. The sounds, my God, the sounds I started hearing at night. At first, they were very subtle. A creak here, a crack there. Things you could easily explain away, like, oh, it's just the old house making noise. But as the days went by, the noises became more intense and frequent. There was one night I heard something that sounded like heavy furniture being dragged. The problem is, it was 2 in the morning. Who the hell drags furniture at that time? And the worst part, the next day, when I took a discreet peek over the fence, everything was in the same place as always. Nothing seemed to have been moved. I started to feel like I was going crazy, as if reality was distorting just on the other side of the fence. I was starting to get obsessed with this situation. I began paying attention to every detail, every suspicious movement. I even changed my work hours to spend more time at home observing. One afternoon, I was sitting on the porch, pretending to read a book, when I saw the old man leaving his house. He looked normal, well-combed gray hair, neat clothes, nothing out of the ordinary. But the way he looked at me, man, it gave me chills. It was an empty look, as if he was seeing me, but at the same time, he wasn't. And then, out of nowhere, he smiled. It wasn't a friendly neighbor smile. It was something different. Kind of crooked, kind of forced. At that moment, I felt my stomach drop. The nights were the worst. I would start to break out in a cold sweat as soon as the sun set, knowing that the strange things were about to start again. One night in particular, I couldn't sleep at all. I was tossing and turning in bed, restless, with that feeling that something was wrong. At some point, I heard a crying sound. But it wasn't normal crying. It was like it was muffled, distant. It was coming from the direction of the old man's house. I was paralyzed in bed, my heart racing. The crying got louder, more desperate. Then, suddenly, it stopped. The silence that followed was even worse than the crying. I lay there, tense, waiting for something more. But nothing happened. That night, I didn't get a wink of sleep. The next day, I woke up with huge dark circles under my eyes and a heavy feeling in my chest. I spent hours debating with myself whether I should talk to someone about what was happening. But who would believe me? A recently divorced guy complaining about an elderly neighbor? It would look like I was losing it. I decided to take a walk around the neighborhood to try to clear my head. As I walked, I noticed that the other houses seemed so normal. Kids playing in the yards, people washing cars, everything so ordinary. But when I passed by the old man's house, I felt like I had entered a bubble of cold air. The lawn, which was well kept before, now looked kind of wilted. All the curtains were closed, and there was a strange smell in the air, kind of like mold mixed with something I couldn't identify. It was at that moment that I saw something that left me cold. In the window on the second floor, through a gap in the curtain, I saw a face watching me. It wasn't the old man's face. It was a pale figure with large, dark eyes. Our gazes met for a second, and I felt as if something had sucked all the energy out of my body. I blinked, and when I looked again, there was nothing there. I ran back to my house, stumbling over my own feet. I locked all the doors and windows as soon as I got in. My heart felt like it was going to jump out of my mouth. I sat on the couch for hours, staring at the wall, trying to understand what I had just seen. Was it really happening, or was I having some kind of mental breakdown? In the days that followed, I was in a constant state of alert. Every noise, every shadow made me jump. I started sleeping with a baseball bat next to the bed, even though I knew it was ridiculous. What was I going to do? Hit a ghost? But the worst part wasn't the things I saw or heard. It was the feeling, as if something was watching me all the time, slowly suffocating me. Even the air inside my house seemed different, heavier. I tried to distract myself with TV, books, anything, but nothing helped. My mind always went back to the house next door and the mysteries it held. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. It was raining heavily, with thunder and lightning. The perfect kind of night for a horror movie. I was in the kitchen, making coffee to try to ward off sleep, when I heard a scream. It wasn't like the muffled crying from before. It was a scream of pure terror, so loud that it overpowered even the sound of the storm. It came from the old man's house, I'm sure of it. I was paralyzed, the coffee cup trembling in my hand. The scream repeated, and this time it sounded more desperate, as if begging for help. My whole body was screaming for me to stay where I was, but something inside me knew I had to do something. With shaky legs, I grabbed a flashlight and went out into the yard, the rain soaking me in seconds. I crossed the waterlogged yard, my feet sinking into the mud with each step. The rain was falling so hard, I could barely see in front of me. I reached the fence separating our houses and hesitated for a second. It was as if I was about to cross an invisible line, entering a territory I shouldn't. But another scream cut through the air, and that gave me the courage I needed. I jumped the fence with difficulty, almost slipping on the wet grass. The old man's house looked even more sinister up close, the dark windows staring at me like black holes. I reached the back door and tried to open it, but it was locked. I knocked hard, shouting over the sound of the rain, "Mr. John, is everything okay in there?" No response. That's when I noticed the door wasn't just locked, it was nailed shut. There were wooden boards nailed over all the windows on the first floor, as if someone had tried to lock themselves inside the house, or lock something out. How hadn't I noticed this before? A lightning bolt lit up the sky, and for an instant, I saw a shadow move behind one of the upstairs windows. My heart almost stopped. It wasn't the old man's silhouette. It was something different, larger, more distorted. At that moment, I heard a noise coming from inside the house, as if something heavy was being dragged across the floor. And then silence. A silence so deep it swallowed even the sound of the rain. I stood there, soaked and trembling, not knowing what to do. Suddenly, all the lights in the house came on at once. It was as if a spotlight had been turned on right in my face. I was blinded for a moment, blinking frantically trying to see something. When my eyes adjusted, I noticed that the back door was open. I swear it was locked and nailed shut a second before. I was paralyzed, torn between fear and curiosity. Part of me wanted to run away from there, but another part needed to know what was going on. With my heart in my mouth, I took a step inside the house. The smell of mold was even stronger in there, mixed with something I couldn't identify. The lights were flashing frantically, as if the power in the whole house was unstable. I called out for Mr. John once more, my voice trembling. No response. I advanced through the kitchen, the hair on the back of my neck standing up. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. Coming from upstairs. Heavy, dragging footsteps. I froze in place, not knowing whether to go up or flee. Before I could make a decision, the footsteps started coming down the stairs. Thump, thump, thump. Slow, deliberate. My whole body was shaking, but I couldn't move. It was as if my feet had taken root in the floor. With each step, the lights flashed faster. The air became even heavier, almost unbreathable. And then, total silence. The lights stopped flashing. Everything went dark suddenly. I heard heavy breathing, very close to me, so close that I felt the hot breath on my neck. I closed my eyes tightly, praying it was just a nightmare. When I opened my eyes again, I was back in my yard. The rain had stopped. The sun was starting to rise on the horizon. I looked around, confused and disoriented. Mr. John House looked normal. No sign of nailed windows, no flashing lights. I ran into my house and locked myself in the bathroom, looking in the mirror to make sure I was real. I stayed there for hours, shaking, trying to understand what had happened. Had I dreamed it all? But then, why were my clothes soaked and muddy? In the days that followed, everything went back to normal. Mr. John continued his routine as if nothing had happened. The lights stopped flashing, objects stopped moving on their own. Even the strange noises ceased. It was as if that night had never existed. I thought about asking Mr. John if he had heard anything strange that night, but every time I rehearsed the question, the words died in my throat. Maybe it was better to leave things as they were. But even today, when I look out the window at night and see the neighbor's house, I feel a shiver run down my spine. Because deep down, I know that whatever happened that night, whatever I saw or felt, that was real. And I have a feeling that one day it might happen again. Second story, it all started on a typical night at my convenience store job. I'd been working the night shift for months to earn extra cash while juggling college. At first, it was chill. Business was slow. I could study during quiet moments and time flew by. But then, out of nowhere, I started noticing this car that always showed up. It was a beat-up silver Corolla with a soccer team sticker on the back window. Things got weird real quick. The car would always arrive around PM and just sit there in the parking lot. The strange part was, the guy never got out to buy anything. He'd just sit there, engine off, lights out. At first, I thought it was a coincidence, but after a couple of weeks of the same thing every night, I started getting suspicious. The lot was pitch black at that hour, so it was impossible not to notice that car sitting there for hours. As days went by, I got more and more paranoid. Every time the car showed up, my heart would race. I tried to focus on work, but my eyes kept drifting to the parking lot, checking if the Corolla was still there. And it always was. One night, I decided to try and get a better look at the driver. I pretended to sweep the entrance, but I couldn't see anything beyond a dark silhouette in the driver's seat. The windows were too tinted, and the lot lighting didn't help. The worst part was not knowing what to do. I thought about telling my boss, but what if I was overreacting? What if it was just some guy waiting for someone? I didn't want to seem crazy or cause trouble for no reason. But at the same time, it was making me super nervous. I started changing my routine. I'd arrive earlier for my shift to avoid crossing the parking lot alone at night. I asked my boyfriend to pick me up after work, which I'd never done before. One night, I decided to be brave and try to find out more about the mysterious car. I pretended to make a call while stepping outside the store. In reality, I was trying to sneakily take a photo of the car. My heart was pounding, my hands shaking so much I could barely hold the phone. When I thought I had a good angle, I quickly snapped a pic and ran back inside. I only looked at the photo after my shift ended, back at home. I was disappointed. The image was all blurry and dark. The next day, I arrived at work, determined to talk to my boss. But before I could say anything, he excitedly told me he'd installed new security cameras in the parking lot. I felt relieved, thinking I'd finally have proof of what was happening. I spent the whole shift anxiously waiting for the Corolla to show up. And at PM, right on schedule, it arrived. I kept an eye on the camera screens, but the angle didn't catch the car well. I could see it arriving and parking, but not inside. Things got even stranger after that. One night, while I was restocking shelves, I heard a noise from outside. It sounded like an engine starting. I ran to the window and saw the Corolla speeding out of the parking lot. I was surprised because the car usually stayed all night. But what really freaked me out was what happened next. About 15 minutes after the car left, a guy covered in blood stumbled into the store asking for help. He was out of breath, clothes torn, with a nasty cut on his forehead. I called the police and an ambulance for the injured guy. While we waited, I debated whether to mention the Corolla that always parked in the lot. But what if it wasn't related? What if it was just a coincidence? When the cops arrived, I ended up not saying anything. They asked the injured guy and me some questions, took notes, and left. The ambulance took the man to the hospital, and I was left alone again, feeling awful for not speaking up. That night, the Corolla didn't come back ... In the following days, I was constantly on edge. The Corolla didn't show up for almost a week, and I started to wonder if I had imagined it all. But then, on a Tuesday night, there it was again. It parked in the same spot as always, like nothing had happened. I felt a chill run down my spine. I decided it was time to do something. I took out my phone and started noting everything. When the car arrived, how long it stayed, any suspicious movements. I thought about calling the cops, but what if they thought I was overreacting? That's when I had an idea. I had a college friend who worked part-time at a driving school. I messaged him asking if he could find out who owned the car based on the license plate. He said he'd try, but it might take a few days. Meanwhile, I kept watching. One night, I noticed something different. The driver got out of the car. It was the first time I'd seen this happen. I froze, watching through the store window. He was tall, wearing a dark jacket and a cap. He stood by the car for a few minutes, looking around, as if searching for something. Suddenly, the man started walking towards the store. I froze. A million thoughts raced through my head in seconds. Did he know I was watching? Was he coming to confront me? Or worse? My hands were shaking so much I could barely hold my phone to try and call 911. But before I could do anything, he stopped. He stood there, about 10 meters from the store entrance, staring right at me. I could feel his gaze even though I couldn't see his face clearly because of the cap. As soon as he got back in the car, I ran to the employee bathroom and threw up. My whole body was shaking, and I couldn't stop crying. I stayed there for a good 15 minutes, trying to pull myself together. When I finally came out, the car was gone. That night, I called my boss and said I was sick and needed to leave. He was concerned, but let me go. On my way home, I got a message from my driving school friend. He had info about the car's owner. But what he told me made my blood run cold. The car had been reported stolen over a month ago. I didn't sleep at all that night. I kept replaying everything in my head, trying to decide what to do. In the morning, I gathered my courage and went to the police station. I told the officer on duty everything. The mysterious car, the bloody guy from last week, the man getting out of the car, and the info about the stolen vehicle. The officer listened carefully and said they'd investigate. I felt a bit relieved for speaking up, but also scared of what might happen. What if the Corolla guy found out I'd gone to the police? In the following days, I was super tense at work. Every noise made me jump. Every passing car put me on alert. The Corolla didn't show up for a few days, and I started to wonder if the police had done something. But then, on a Wednesday night, there it was again. It parked in the same spot as always. My heart raced. I called the number the officer had given me, but it went to voicemail. I was desperate, not knowing what to do. That's when I noticed something different. There was a police car parked across the street, half hidden. I watched, torn between fear and curiosity. The Corolla sat there for about an hour, as usual. Suddenly, I saw movement. The driver got out, looked around, and started walking towards the store. My heart nearly jumped out of my chest. But before he got close, the police car turned on its sirens and 2 officers ran towards the man. It all happened so fast. The guy tried to run back to the car, but the cops were quicker. There was a brief struggle, but soon they had him immobilized, and in the police car, I stood there, paralyzed behind the counter, watching it all unfold. One of the officers came to talk to me. He explained they'd set up an operation based on my report. The man was suspected of a series of robberies in the area, and the Corolla was used as a base to observe potential targets. Apparently, he'd chosen the store's parking lot because it was a strategic point with a view of several streets. The officer thanked me for reporting it and said my action had helped catch a dangerous criminal. In the days that followed, I had trouble processing everything that had happened. The parking lot went back to being empty at night, but I still found myself looking out there, half expecting to see the silver Corolla. It took a while for me to feel safe at work again. Sometimes I still have nightmares about that night when the man got out of the car and walked towards the store. I wonder what would have happened if the police hadn't been there. But in the end, I'm relieved I followed my instincts and reported it. Third story. That day is forever etched in my memory. It was a summer Saturday afternoon. I had just turned 16 and was bored at home, scrolling through my phone when I got a message from Josh. "Hey, wanna go out?" I'm thinking of checking out that abandoned house at the end of the street. I felt a chill immediately. Everyone in town knew about that house, but no one ever dared to go near it. They said the family living there had vanished without a trace 20 years ago, and since then, The place had been abandoned, becoming the source of all kinds of horror stories. I hesitated for a moment, but curiosity got the better of me. I replied that I was in, and within minutes, I was meeting Josh and two other friends, Emily and Mike, at the corner. As we walked towards the house, Emily began sharing the stories she'd heard. My aunt said the owner was kind of strange, lived alone, and rarely went out. One day, the neighbors noticed they hadn't seen any movement for weeks and called the police. When they entered, they found no one, but there was rotting food in the fridge and clothes in the closets. It was as if the person had evaporated. When we reached the gate, we stood there for a few seconds, looking at each other. No one wanted to be the first to enter. Mike, always the bravest of the group, finally stepped forward and pushed the gate. The sharp creak it made sounded like a scream in the silence of the deserted street. I swallowed hard and followed the others along the overgrown path to the porch. Josh tried to open the front door, but it was locked. He went around the house and we followed, stepping carefully to avoid making noise. At the back, we found a window slightly open. Josh and Mike looked at each other and, without a word, started forcing the window open wider. I wanted to say we should leave, that this was crazy, but the words got stuck in my throat. When the window finally gave way, the smell of mold and abandonment that came from inside the house almost made me vomit. Emily made a face, but was the first to climb through the window. I took a deep breath and followed her, feeling my heart beating so hard I thought it might explode. Inside the house, the darkness was almost palpable. We used our phone flashlights to illuminate the way, revealing a living room covered in dust and cobwebs. Emily whispered, pointing to a half-open door, "Look, it must be the basement." At that moment, we heard a noise coming from there, as if something had fallen. We all froze in place, barely daring to breathe. Mike, trying to sound brave, said softly, "It must be just a rat or something," but I could see the fear in his eyes. Josh, with a trembling voice, suggested, "Let's take a quick look and then leave, okay?" We descended the basement stairs in single file, with Josh in the lead. Each step creaked under our feet, and I was sure my heart was beating so loudly that anyone could hear it. The smell of mold got even stronger, mixed with something I couldn't identify at the time. When we reached the bottom of the stairs, Josh illuminated the environment with his phone flashlight. We slowly approached, fascinated and horrified at the same time. The headlines talked about mysterious disappearances in the region, unsolved cases dating back decades. Emily pointed to one of the clippings and whispered, "Look, this one is from 1985. It talks about an entire family that vanished without a trace. As we read the clippings, a pattern began to emerge. Suddenly, a noise from upstairs made us jump. It sounded like slow, heavy footsteps. We looked at each other in panic, and Mike whispered, "I thought we had checked the whole house." Josh, with a trembling voice, replied, "We did." Fear took over me when I realized we weren't alone there. Emily grabbed my arm so tightly it hurt, her eyes wide with terror. In that moment of sheer terror, Josh did something I'll never forget. He suddenly stood up, knocking over some boxes. The noise echoed through the basement, causing us all to panic. "Run!" Josh yelled, and he didn't need to say it twice. We darted out from behind the boxes, running up the stairs as fast as we could. I heard more things falling and Josh shouting behind us. We reached the upper floor stumbling and pushing each other. Mike was the first to reach the window we had entered through. He practically threw himself out, and Emily followed. I was about to do the same when I realized Josh wasn't with us. I turned and saw him at the foot of the stairs, pale and panting. "Come on," I shouted, extending my hand to him. Josh ran towards me, but tripped and fell. I don't know how I managed to get home. My mind went blank, and the next moment I remember is sitting on my bed, shaking and sweating cold. The next day, the news spread quickly through town. Josh had been caught breaking into the abandoned house. The real owner, a reclusive old man who rarely went out, had returned home that night and caught us by surprise. The police were called, and Josh ended up being detained. He tried to explain that we were all there, but Emily, Mike, and I, afraid of the consequences, denied everything. We said Josh had gone alone and that we knew nothing about it. The guilt was eating me up inside, but the fear of getting caught was greater. Josh ended up with a criminal record for trespassing. 5 years have passed since that night, and I still feel guilty about what happened to Josh. Sometimes I think about looking for him, telling everyone the truth, but fear and shame always hold me back. The house is still there, now with a new fence and security cameras. The mystery is gone, but the memory of what our curiosity and cowardice caused remains.